Okay, we're on the air. Okay, you guys, because of last week and the schedule stuff, second period's like 2 classes behind you.
Yeah.
What? No.
No notes. No notes.
Set things down.
No notes.
You can take a date and do nothing.
Anybody see my clicker?
Let's give them a couple days to catch up.
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
No notes.
No, that's Mr. Bell's. This? No, that's the.
He lost his class.
Okay. All right, we've got to come to order, focus. All the technical, technology is great till it doesn't work, right? Hitler, we covered Hitler first. Remember I told you that in chronological order it should have been Mussolini first, because Mussolini was kind of laid the groundwork for a guy like Hitler to say, hey, look what they did in Italy. I can create a government like that. I can consolidate my power like my hero, my man Benito Mussolini did. I won't call them black shirts, I'll call them, or what's the Star Wars name? Stormtroopers, and I'll send them out to intimidate my enemies. And at first, it was a slow process. We look at history and we'll read a paragraph and cover like decades, right? It was a slow process. So Hitler slowly gained more and more power. And then we said in 1930, all of a sudden it went whoop. And then 1932 through the roof. Because not only did he have the support of Germans who were dissatisfied because of the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, and their economy never recovered, now it's been doubled down on because of the Depression, and now people are looking for a savior. People are like begging for a person, like not consciously, but subconsciously, they're begging for a person to come in and save the day. And unfortunately, Hitler, as he was taking away people's individual liberty, because remember, both Italy and Germany were republics. They had governments kind of like we had. The American Revolution spawned a freedom revolution worldwide. So most people in Europe were now living under this idea of individual liberty. When Mussolini took over in Italy, his goal was to make Italy back to the empire days. How are you going to do that? You're not going to do that unless you have dictatorial powers, right? And Italy was in a bad financial crisis. So they were willing to give and accede power to him. Same with Hitler. That's why do we study history? To learn from the past, right? So when times get hard, in times of crisis, going back to it, I'll say it probably 100 times by the time the year's over, people, when faced with the choice between liberty and security, you're always going to have a lot of people, depending on how much the fear is, depending on how insecure they feel, that will give up liberty so they can have that security. So that gives audience to a person, if they're evil enough, like Hitler or Mussolini or Stalin, that we'll learn about. We already learned about Stalin, didn't you? The other class didn't. You haven't learned about Stalin yet? That will use that fear and insecurity to take that power. There's a lot of people that think like this. I would never do that. So they're like, really? Do you think there's people like that? Because you would never do it. I know you would never do it. I would never. But then when you do also realize that unfortunately we live in a fallen world and there's a lot of evil people, aren't there? And if you take it down to a micro level, I think I mentioned this last week, you take this kind of power hungry type person to a micro level on the playground, at school when you're growing up, or in relationships that you've had, you know that there's people that are control people, right? They like to control other people. You take that to a macro mass scale, and you get people like these guys, these tyrants. Because people, unfortunately, have a lust for power. We like to have control of situations, and some people like to have control of other people. Part of our sin nature. So we ended up here. Did you see Stalin yet? I'm sorry. You didn't see Stalin yet. We ended up here with Mussolini. You see these pictures? The fasces. Okay. And then we did Hirohito. Sorry. Hirohito's the emperor. Tojo's the military dictator. We did him. Yeah? We got all that? I just realized that's what we left off. Sorry for my confusion, but like I said, the other class isn't even close to where you guys were. We left off with this Washington Naval Treaty, 1934. Remember that Japan and Washington came up with a treaty that they would, not mess with each other, open up diplomatic relations, trade relations. Japan decides unilaterally, that means by themselves, UNI 1, by themselves, they're just going to cancel that treaty. They didn't get with America and say, hey, let's negotiate a new treaty. They just said, we're out. It's kind of a sign of things to come. We go back and we look what they were doing. We look at how Tojo visited the United States and said, man, these people are weak-minded people. Our military, the way our military, we're building our military, and the loyalty and the commitment to excellence and victory that's instilled in our Japanese soldiers. We went to war with the Americans. They think there's some kind of great economic power in the world. If it came down to a fight between us and them, we're going to destroy them. They're weak. And then I said, I wonder what some of our enemies today think of our military. I mean, that's what they thought of it 100 years ago. And now we've got a military focused on a lot of other things rather than blowing things up and killing people. Unfortunately, that's the way of it, right? We don't like you like to learn about war, but war is HE double hockey sticks, not something anybody wants to do. But what's the purpose of having a military? To defend your country. Because there's going to come a time you might have to blow things up and kill people. Are we ready to do that? Compared to what other countries are ready to do. Unfortunately, like maybe even today, right? Not that you should be too concerned, because your teacher still believes that's not going to happen. By the way, the price of oil went up to over $100 a barrel. Guess who's happy? Guess who's happy? The price of oil went up over $100 a barrel. That might not mean a whole lot to you, but not that long ago, it was way less than 70. Guess who's happy about the price of oil going up? Does anybody know the leader of Russia, what his name is? You've all heard of it, I think. Putin, right? So Putin's the one, this leader of Russia, that you're hearing on the news. Russia's going to invade Ukraine. Is it going to be World War III? We're learning about World War II. Is it going to be World War III? My contention is it isn't, because how much that would cost them a lot. And right now, by having all the tension, by having all the world waiting, oh no, what's going to happen next? The price of oil is going up. Guess who's the third biggest exporter of oil in the world? Russia. Guess who's profiting from the price of oil going up? Russia. Why would they like the idea that the world's at a tension level? But I can't get myself to think that, because they're not dumb, that they would do that and cause such crisis in the world. It might, because then what happens? What if we, I say we, like NATO and the allies of the United States, and the United States is diplomatically involved at this point. What if we cut off their supply of oil to the rest of the world? Are they going to be willing to do that? I don't think. So we'll see, but I don't think so. 1937, under Tojo's leadership, Japan goes into a full-scale war against China. You probably never heard of that, right? You knew that there was a World War II. You knew that Hitler was involved in starting it in 1939. You might even know it started in 1939. But you probably didn't know that in the Far East, Japan and China were already engaged in war after Japan invaded the area known as Manchuria. So this Tojo guy, we don't usually think of him as the face of evil like we would Stalin or Hitler. Keep saying Stalin again, I got you yet. Hitler or Stalin, but he is on the rise in the East. Anybody know what that is? Hopefully not a bad thing.
As Ruth.
What's going on with the internet?
As Ruth.
So why do we always do things like before they happen? Like today's Valentine's Day, right? Valentine's Day is already over. Am I right? Like at school, we celebrated it Friday. Your parents, if they did anything, like went out to eat or something, they did it over the weekend. So now Valentine gets here and it's like anticlimactic.
Waste of a day.
The elementary, yeah. What's that?
I didn't celebrate on Friday. I have school today.
Yeah, I don't know.
Because it
Ruthless
goes
dictators came to power in Europe.
Lights, please. Please don't stop it.
Far East. How and why did Japan emerge as a military power during the 1920s and 1930s? Much of its history, warriors have been the most respected member of Japanese society. Samurai were the highest social class, and their devotion to the emperor was unquestioned. However,
By the way, you may or may not remember from world history, if you're a freshman, you haven't had world history yet, but from world history last year as sophomores, you learned that in the East, India, the highest class of people were the priestly class. In China, the highest class of people were the educated, scholarly class. But in Japan, the highest class of people are the warriors. So you got those three main countries that we consider in the East, India, China, and Japan, and they all kind of have a class system where each one's different. In India, because Hinduism is such a big deal, that the priestly class is number one. In China, because education is such a big deal, the scholar class is number one. But in Japan, warriors are number one. Anybody ever see The First Samurai? No one here seen it?
The last
Or The Last Samurai? Did I say
Oh,
first?
Bruce?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did I say first?
Yeah.
over time, this tradition had broken down, and by the 1920s, democratic principles had taken hold in Japanese life. Japan experienced great economic success in the 1920s, and the victories of the Democratic Allies in World War I led many to believe that democracy was the wave of the future. This changed with the onset of the Great Depression in 1929. Japan, with very limited resources, was devastated by the Great Depression.
So what's going to happen? Democracy was taking hold in Japan in the 20s. This idea of the prosperity from the Roaring 20s in the United States. So 150 years after our revolution, this idea of individual freedom. And in Japan, the idea of having a democratic republic was rising. Everybody was doing well. What's going to happen when the depression hits? What's going to change? The two big words I wrote on the board in the fall. Why? What are the two words that we have to choose between? Liberty and security, right? So all of this idea that, hey, we're loving our individual liberty, these democratic principles. Crisis. And in history, what happens when there's a crisis? People are open to someone, anyone, please come save us. So they will grant power to people because those people will promise to bring them out of whatever that current crisis is, whatever they are so afraid of at that time. Many times when we say economic crisis, like in America, we're like, oh, there's a recession or something. The price went up, like we're experiencing inflation. We're not experiencing anything like some of the countries throughout history have experienced. Even recent history, when it comes to inflation and Venezuela, we're not experiencing anything like that at this point, right? But we did experience over the last 2 years a great wave of fear about the virus. So what did we do as a people? Some of us fought vehemently and vocally and loudly and against it, but we said, okay, you can have that power. We'll do what you say. We'll stay in our houses for a year. We'll close down our business. We'll bankrupt the country because of the fear, right? So we'll give up all those liberties to have the security that we're not all going to die from this virus. That's why there's such division. That's why the division is greater now, because you had this group of people that are so willing. And as Ben Franklin said, those who would give up liberty for a little security deserve neither. And now, what do you see in the last month? Now you're seeing a pushback. By the way, it's not just in Canada. It's not just in America. If you watch the news over the weekend, you've got protests all over Europe. I saw in New Zealand over the weekend. These protests that started with the Canadian truckers, who are becoming quickly like world famous heroes, because they're the ones that finally took a stand against, what the government was doing. You can't open your business. You have to take a forced injection. You got to do all this. And this pushback is finally happening. You should be cheering that. Liberty, it's important.
The economic prosperity the island nation had experienced depended heavily on foreign trade, with Japan exporting luxury items such as silk in exchange for essential products like coal and oil. When the world economy collapsed, Japan's silk market crashed. With millions of Japanese facing starvation, ambitious nationalists claimed that the embracement of Western values had caused the enormous levels of suffering. High-ranking military officers argued that the problems the nation faced were due to a lack of space and resources. With 65 million people crowded onto 4 tiny islands, officers insisted that Japan needed to expand their empire via conquest and colonization. From their bases in Korea, Japan hoped to expand into a section of China known as Manchuria, arguing that the region had everything that Japan needed. Manchuria offered land for farming, room to colonize, and a rich array of resources. In 1931, a bomb planted by Japanese soldiers destroyed a section of a Japanese-controlled railway in Manchuria. Japan presented it to the world as an unprovoked attack by the Chinese army, and Japanese troops flooded into Manchuria. Within a matter of months, Manchuria became a protectorate of Japan.
You following? See what they did? Blew up their own railway, right? So then they could blame it on the Chinese. So the rest of the world says, hey, what are you doing? You can't just go invading another country, right? Wilson set up the League of Nations, which now we call that the United Nations. Wilson set up the League of Nations after World War I so that all the countries would, get together and meet and try to maintain that a world war would never happen again. So if one country ever just decides, hey, I'm going to invade another country, the rest of the world leaders get together and say, hey, what are you doing here? This can't be. Well, if you can claim that the Chinese blew up the train, you're certainly entitled to retaliate, right? And it was that easy.
Manchuria, roughly the size of Germany and France combined, became the prime source of iron, steel, and coal for Japan. After their success in Manchuria, military leaders increased their influence and control over Japanese society. They assassinated 2 prime ministers, arrested government officials, and imposed harsh censorship. They used the schools and the media to present propaganda on behalf of the new government. In 1937, Japan invaded China proper, capturing several major cities. China, the world's most populated country, seemed helpless to stop the Japanese advances. The League of Nations, aware of Japan's immense brutality in China, offered little support to Chinese requests for assistance. When the Japanese delegate to the League was asked to explain the actions of his nation, he called the French and British hypocrites, noting that their countries had been the first to acquire interest in China. Following this exchange, Japan walked out of the League of Nations. Meanwhile, Japan's stunning successes in China firmly established the military's influence over the emperor and his government.
And that's leading to Japan's kind of now isolated themselves again, right, from the world, not just economy, but from the world diplomat stage. They just walked out. I'm not going to sit here and talk to you Europeans who have these empires all over the world, and then when we go in to a place like Manchuria, you're going to act like we're so bad when he's going to accuse them of doing the same thing. So he walks out. So now you don't have any relations going on from 1937 to 1941 when they attacked Pearl Harbor. And the whole idea of the League of Nations or the United Nations is to keep people at the meeting table, because if you're talking to each other, there's less chance for something like that to happen, right? Right? Even in your personal relationships, you get mad at someone. Biblically, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to go to them, try to make things bring peace again, not give them the cold shoulder and ignore them. And you're right. That just leads to more problems. Right, Morgan?
Yeah.
Be kind ye one to another. What's that? Candygrams?
Yeah. It's not really good.
Yep. Wow, I transition here. And by the way, speaking of liberty and security, the Japanese leaders were able to say, oh, these great ideas supposedly of democracy from the West, look what they got us.
Yeah, there's gotta be some. I bet there's gonna. It's probably just. Maybe even
Oh boy, yeah. You got more? Morgan's in here already.
Yeah, no one's gonna cry if they don't get any, right? We're not like the
We're just so you know, Brenna, you are worldwide live right now on YouTube.com.
You didn't get it.
Why?
I think I have two guns.
I don't think that's.
We take this short break here at Heartland Christian to spread the love of Valentine's Day with our candygrams. Verity.
It's okay.
Yes. Mom. Baby came through. Hey, Isaac. 1-0. You can't be serious. Except from. You can't do this. My mother. I gave her a gift. Oh, there's no dating your mom.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Ella, you have another
They said he looks like Hitler, but like
You used to Hitler? Poor Derek feels so unloved.
Thanks for telling me.
I had an extra dollar.
He didn't feel unloved until he told me.
Until you said that.
Just so you know, I'm
Alright.
my brother.
So this is Tojo. This is the military dictator. This is at a very young age, obviously, Hirohito, who comes to the throne as emperor as a very young man. Of course, he is deity in Japan. This guy's job is to make sure that all people show their loyalty and obedience, and even to death, to the demigod, their emperor, Hirohito. So whatever that takes to get that done, that's what Tojo is willing to do as a loyalist to his country. Okay, we will, I guess, just introduce the next tyrant. Joseph Stalin. When you think of Russia, when you think of this area of the world, Russia is a huge country that used to be the biggest part of something called the Soviet Union. And after World War II, it's going to be called the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Russia is the country that the Bolsheviks took over. There are several other countries that got absorbed by Russia and the Soviets over the years. And one of those places has the same name as one of our states. Anybody know what it is? Yeah, Georgia. And that's actually where Stalin was born. So make sure you know, Elise, that you don't try to tell anybody, Elise, at the dinner table tonight that Stalin was born in America. He was not born in the state in the United States, Georgia. He was born in I'm going to confuse you more. He was born in the state called Georgia, south of Russia. Because you remember that a country is a state, right? Right? That a country, a nation, and a state are all the same. The country is the geographic border, the nation's the people, and the state is the government of that country. Well, this guy, Joseph Stalin, who you're going to learn, because Hitler's kind of the face of evil, and most people don't know Stalin as well as they know Hitler, but some scholars believe that Stalin actually killed more of his own people than Hitler. And look at this. He's educated at seminary. While he's at seminary, he goes to libraries and secretly starts to read about some very influential teachings from a guy that wrote this book back in 1848 called The Communist Manifesto. Who was that guy? There's two people in the mid to late 1800s that their ways of thinking started to dominate academia. One was Darwin and his theory of evolution, and the other was Karl Marx and his theories on economics. So Marx, being a contemporary of Darwin, and then so the next generation is learning about these two theories that kind of take over academia, and some people blend those two together. So there starts to be something called social Darwinism, where Marx takes the idea of Darwin's biological theory of evolution and he applies that to the social arena, to economics, to the class system, right? Survival of the fittest. You know, we need to rise up against this whole idea of the natural way of things, because if we don't, then the haves will always take advantage of the have-nots if we don't unify together. Anyway, while he's at seminary, he starts reading about Karl Marx. Of course, he has to do this in secret because Marx's teaching goes against biblical teaching. Even though there are people that try to teach you the opposite. Because people, like I said, you could be taught evolution and walk out of there thinking, wait, I mean, I don't believe 2 + 2 is 4. It could be taught in such a way. Anyway, he becomes Secretary General of the Communist Party, the Bolsheviks. If you remember, they took over during World War I, 1917. Russia went through a revolution where the communists kicked out their king, which they called Tsar, and established their communist rule. And they don't call them president, they call them Secretary General. Does anybody remember what Stalin? Does anybody remember how Joseph Stalin got the name Stalin? Go ahead.
Doesn't it mean steel?
He, as he was growing up and having this inclination to want to dominate people and thinking he was so tough, his name actually wasn't Joseph Stalin when he was born. He kind of took on that name because he was calling himself the man of steel. Because he's so tough. And you don't want to mess with Stalin, the man of steel. So that's what we'll pick up tomorrow.
Not again.
Call me?
Steel. That's super.
Oh.